Hey everyone, it's Matt here with Nightrun Studio and welcome back to our Metroidvania tutorial series. In our last video we added a new state to our player, getting him so that he can now wall jump. However, trying to descend those walls is still a little bit awkward. So in this video we're going to add a wall slide state which will add an animation and allow our player to descend slowly down the side of walls and jump off them if he wants. That's where we're headed in this video. Let's get started. Alright, now as usual, let's start by creating our animation. So first off, we'll make sure to open up our player and click on his sprite. I'm then going to grab my animation pane and just drag it up top here so we can see the sprites below. If you're using Brolov's generic character pack, we're going to be in the character blue 2 here. And if I open up the sprite editor, you can see that we've got a nice wall slide here. So take note of those, number 18 through to 21. Let's click into our animator here and create a new clip. I'm going to go to my animations folder and we'll call this one wall slide. Now we can come down below and I'll just shift click 18 through 21 to drag them up here. I'm just going to turn off my gizmos so that I can see a little more clearly, and that looks pretty decent. The only thing is we want this to be a looping animation, and so what I'm going to do is sort of mirror it. So I'll get the second last animation, number 20, and paste it next, and then number 19 after that, and then we'll wrap with a complete loop back at 18. If we hit play, it's looking about right, except that it's really fast, so we'll just stretch this one out here over a little longer, and that's looking pretty good. Alright, let's put our animation pane away, and now we can head up to our animator and figure out our state transitions. I'm just going to put wall slide down at the bottom here, and then we can add a new parameter. This one will be a bool like most of our others, and we'll call it isWallSliding. I also like to drag it to the top here. At this point, let's make a transition that goes into wall slide, and another one leaving. And then if we click on the transition in here, we just want to make sure that our condition is that wall sliding is true. Now to leave, we're going to first of all make sure that it has no exit time or duration, as we want it to exit immediately, and it will exit whenever isWallSliding is false. Alright, that's actually all that there is to do here. We're ready to get writing a script. So let's head back to our assets folder, get into our player scripts, and let's create a new one called player wall slide state. As usual, we'll make a bare bones state to start so that we can test and then add more complexity as we go. So we can begin by getting rid of our start and update method and making sure that we are inheriting from player state. At this point, we can create our constructor, which is just going to be a public player wall slide state that will take in a player reference and then pass that same reference along to our base state so that both of them have access to all our variables and methods within our player script. As usual, we'll start by overriding the enter method from our base state, and here we'll just tell our animator to set its bool for isWallSliding to true. At this point, we can create our update method, though for now we're not going to run any logic inside of there, and then we can jump ahead to our fixed update state where our physics are going to happen. Now our physics are actually pretty straightforward. We just want to tell our rigid body that its linear velocity will be equal to a new vector. We'll construct it at runtime. And it's just going to always be a 0 on the x, as we don't want to move horizontally while sliding. And then we'll just use a variable we've not yet made called wall slide speed for our y. We can store that variable right here inside the state, so we'll make a float for wall slide speed, and I'll initialize it at -2f, which will just cause me to have a slow downward trajectory. And even though this one won't be serialized in the inspector, you can just change it in the state here if you want to try out different speeds. Now I'm just realizing that I put a capital P on the player that I'm passing to base, and that's the class rather than the name we're using for it, and that'll give you an error if we don't change it. So I'll just fix that quickly, and at this point we're ready to actually create our transitions into the player wall slide state. Let's start by heading to our player jump state, as this is the first of 2 states that will be able to send us into a wall slide. So let's come down into update where we run all of our transition logic. And we'll set this one right at the top, and we just want to check first of all to see if our player is not grounded. Next, we want to see if he is currently touching a wall. And sorry, this one's a bit of a beast as we have 2 more checks. We also want to see if our move input along the x or horizontal axis is actually the same direction we're facing. And then finally, we just want to make sure that we're only doing this if our rigid body's linear velocity on the y is downwards, as wall sliding while moving up would create some awkward effects and mess with our wall jump. Now if all that's true, we want our player to change state to the player wall slide state, and then we also just want to add an else here so that we only move on if this statement is not true. Now we can copy that beast of an if statement, head over to our player wall jump state, and just paste it in at the top of our update method. Once again, don't forget to add the else to our next if statement so that we're not evaluating more than one of these. Alright, we've got our logic and our basic physics set up. However, we'd get errors if we went into Unity now, and that's just because our player doesn't actually know about this new state. So let's head into player and make a new player wall slide state called wall slide state. And then down in awake, we'll initiate the wall slide state and pass along this player script so that it has access to it. Alright, let's give this a test. Alright, no setup necessary in Unity. However, when we try this out, you'll notice that there's some weirdness going on here. Essentially, we can still wall jump. However, when we're trying to slide, we end up not actually playing our animation, and it does some weird things with flipping. If we look at our animator, we'll notice it's because we're actually stuck in our falling state at the moment, and the reason for that is because the only way to leave is if we're grounded. So if I turn the game back on, when I get to the bottom, he'll finally go to his wall slide state once I reach the ground, which is clearly not what we want. So what we're going to do here is create a new transition out of falling. We're going to go up to our base, and we actually want to go all the way to our state machine base layer. This will just allow us to exit falling, not just when we're on the ground, but also if, and here we'll just put 0 for exit time and duration, and we want to be able to leave if is wall sliding is ever true. With that little tweak now, when I get in, we actually enter wall slide right away, but you'll notice we're kind of getting buried in the wall, and also we're not exiting the state ever, which we knew because we haven't done that logic. Let's fix the animation first though. So the problem here is just really to do with the fact that our animation is a little bit off to one side. So if we go into our wall slide state, we'll click on the first frame here, go over to make sure we're recording, and then head to our transform where we just add a small negative value to our X. That way throughout this entire animation, he'll just be scaled a little bit in that direction, and then once it's finished, he'll go back to normal. So if we give that a try, you can see that now, sliding on the wall, this is looking pretty good. That said, at the moment, when I am sliding, if I press horizontal, you'll notice it's doing some weird flip stuff. So let's head into the code and fix this. So now's that moment where we can get rid of our green note about logic in update and actually write that logic. So here essentially, if we ever press jump while we are wall sliding, we'll want to first of all make sure that we consume that jump pressed by setting it false, and then we just want to make sure that our player knows to change state and send us to the player wall jump state. However, jumping isn't our only exit here, so we'll add an else if, and what happens if we're sliding down a wall but we run out of wall and come to an opening? So if our player is no longer touching the wall, we're going to want to change. And then we'll also add another possibility, so we'll do an or statement here. And if the absolute value of our move input on the X suddenly becomes less than a very small amount. So essentially, if we stop pushing towards the wall, we want to be able to just drop off of it. Now, if either of those things happen, we're just going to tell our player to change state back to the idle state, and we'll drop off of here and resume normal handling for our states. At this point, we'll just come down below, create our override exit method, and as usual, this is where we'll tell our anim to set its bool for this state to false. Now, if you pop back into Unity, you'll find those happy red messages for you, and forgive me, my error messaging has stopped working inside of Visual Studio, so I sometimes miss this stuff. But I just made a little error here with my brackets. We need to actually find the absolute of our move inputs X. If we put all of that in the brackets, it's causing problems as the math just doesn't math. All right, with that fix, let's test this thing out. All right, now when we get in the game, we have the ability to wall jump and also to wall slide. You'll notice I'm sometimes getting a little gap. That has to do with the size of my is touching wall. I'm detecting the wall just a little before I actually get to it, and you can play with that if you like, but it's not bothering me too much. All right, that concludes our player state for this time. Starting in our next video, we're gonna actually get into some combat and enemy AI. Hope to see you in those videos. Until then though, this is Matt with Nightrun Studio. Cheers.